Hi, I'm here with Tony Annett, the author of Cathonomics, who recently had an article in Commonweal about Christian democratic parties and their commitment to subsidiarity in the wake of World War II. Tony, I'd like to start with a question that begins in that era. How did this experience of World War II and that era of totalitarianism shape the development of Catholic social teaching after the war?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. I'm happy to do this with you. Yeah, I mean, the piece was entitled Born Out of Catastrophe. And I think that you can't understand Christian democracy without appreciating that sense of catastrophe. Um, the whole political spectrum had been discredited. Um, the political right had made alliances with fascists and Nazis, including many Catholics, by the way, in European countries. The left had been tempted by Stalinism. So, there was a whole period of rethinking, like, what are we doing here? What mistakes did we make? How did we end up with the war and the Holocaust and Europe in complete ruins? So the Christian Democrats basically appealed to the tradition of Catholic social teaching to rebuild. Obviously, at the time, this was in 1945, so they would have had the seminal Catholic social teaching. There would have been Rerum Novarum in 1891 by Pope Leo the 13th. There would have been Quadragesimo Anno by Pope Pius the 11th in 1931. But the thing we have to understand is this is very early Catholic social teaching. When we think of Catholic social teaching today, we think of this incredibly rich tradition of the Second Vatican Council, of Pope John the 23rd, Pope Paul the 6th, Pope John Paul the 2nd, all the way through to Pope Francis. But the Christian Democrats had none of that. They were basically on their own for a large part of this, with the very basic building blocks of Catholic social teaching. So, against that background, what they built was actually pretty remarkable. And what they were willing to do was they would take the building blocks of Catholic social teaching, such as solidarity, subsidiarity, the universal destination of goods, but they were willing to kind of push it further than maybe the official church was comfortable with at the time. One of the arguments I made in my piece is that official Catholic social teaching eventually caught up with what the Christian Democrats were doing, but often 1 or 2 decades later. So what they were doing, and these were lay people, by the way, not priests or bishops, what they were doing was pretty remarkable. They were taking this tradition of Catholic social teaching and saying, how do we apply this to the concrete circumstances of post-war Europe, given the devastation and given that we need a whole new political and economic system?
Yes. Could you talk a little bit about Jacques Maritain and personalism, both as the foundation of Christian democracy, and then, as you said, these personalist ideas shape the development of Catholic social teaching?
Yeah, so Maritain is a very interesting figure. So he basically started off as an integralist, a very right-wing Christian nationalist, almost as it were. But as he saw fascism for what it really was, he completely changed his position and he came to endorse liberal democracy. And he argued very strongly that liberal democracy has Christian roots. And if you want to understand liberal democracy, you really need to appreciate the Christian principles that underpin it. Now, again, that was a fairly radical position at the time. I mean, the official Catholic Church was coming around to liberal democracy. Pope Pius XII, in his Christmas messages, made very tentative messages signaling an openness to liberal democracy. But it wasn't until the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s that the church made its full peace with liberal democracy. So Maritain was very much ahead of his time. Now, his personalism is based on the idea that we want to center a political and economic system around the human person with infinite dignity and worth. Now, that distinguishes it from both communist totalitarianism, which suppresses the human personality completely, but it also distinguishes it from the kind of Anglo American tradition of individualism and free market economics, which says that everybody is an individual disconnected from social ties, out to maximize their own personal benefit. So, in that sense, personalism is kind of an in-between position between individualism and collectivism. And this was what Christian democracy basically centered their whole political structure on. Now, Maritain, so another point about Maritain is he was a Thomist. He was a student of Thomas Aquinas. So he very much bought into the Thomist position that everything and everything in nature and every human being has a purpose, an end, a finality to which they're oriented to. And of course, um, Catholics would argue that, based on the Aristotelian tradition, that that is in the temporal life human flourishing. So Maritain argued that if your end, if your goal is truly this sense of human flourishing, this full thriving life, then you need the goods necessary for that human flourishing. And that gives rise to a very Catholic notion of human rights. You have the right to goods such as safety, such as food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, decent and rewarding work. And this became official Catholic social teaching with Pope John the 23rd's Pachamentarum in 1963. But Maritain was 2 decades ahead of that in the kind of positions he was arguing. So again, very much ahead of his time.
Right. That establishment of human rights and his contribution to the global discourse on human rights, and then reciprocal responsibilities, right? That we all have to
Absolutely.
ensure that people get those rights and can live a life that is flourishing.
Yes.
Shifting to subsidiarity.
Mm.
In the article, you say the Christian democratic welfare state was predicated on the twin pillars of solidarity and subsidiarity, both concepts drawn from Catholic social teaching. Where do we see that distinct Christian democratic commitment to subsidiarity?
Okay. So let me back up and say, and I'm sure, Robert, you've been over this in great detail, but I'll just summarize very quickly that, subsidiarity has two parts. One part is you want to set the locus of decision making at the level most appropriate for that decision making. And often that is the most local level possible, but sometimes it's at a higher level. And sometimes it's actually even at the global level. Pope Benedict XVI made this argument in his Caritas in Veritate encyclical. But for Christian democracy, so that's part one of subsidiarity, the locus of decision making. Part two of subsidiarity says that higher level authorities like the state need to furnish help to lower level authorities like individuals, families, local communities, labor unions to be able to fulfill their natural purposes. So, how does that work in a Christian democratic welfare state? Um, you want to support families. So if you are a breadwinner and you lose your job or you become disabled or you're over the age of 65 and you retire, um, you need to have the resources necessary to live a dignified life in society. So the state's role is to step in and say, we will give you pensions, we will give you unemployment assistance, we will give you disability benefits. But Robert, you mentioned the connection between rights and responsibilities. So the way this is set up is it's the insurance model. So you have the right to all these benefits, but throughout your working life, you are paying contributions. You are paying into a fund for retirement, for unemployment, for disability, for healthcare, for all these different things, so that when the time comes when you need help, the government is willing to step in and provide that help, but you yourself have taken on the responsibility to pay into this system. So there's the twinning of rights and responsibilities. This is a little bit different from the Scandinavian model of social assistance,
Right.
which is very much based on you have the right to all these benefits as a right of citizenship, and we pay for it generally out of general taxation. So there's no automatic connection between what you're paying in and what you're getting out. It's a much more of a larger pooled resource.
Pope Francis, I think on a number of occasions, and Pope Leo in the past year have held up Adenauer of Germany, Schumann of France, De Gasperi of Italy as models for today. When
Yeah.
it comes to ensuring subsidiarity while promoting the common good, are there lessons from their leadership that we can draw on today?
I think there are quite a number of lessons, and you know, um, two of these three figures have are on the path to sainthood. They have they have ongoing causes. Schumann's is most advanced, but there's also a cause has been open for Alcide de Gasperi. All three were Catholic. Um, all three took their Catholic faith extremely seriously and built social market economies based on the principle of Catholic social teaching. And also, by the way, very clearly embraced liberal democracy, which in 1945 was not a given thing. Um, Another thing associated with these three figures are regarded as the founding fathers of the European Union. Because another dimension of subsidiarity is some issues are so big that they go beyond the nation state and need to be decided globally. Jacques Maritain, by the way, believed in a form of world government. Now, you might say he was a bit idealistic, he was a bit naive, okay, but he believed that. And the European Union was very much based on the idea that if you want to secure peace and cooperation between these countries, which had just emerged from a devastating war, you needed to join together in a multilateral way to cooperate. Um, so you had this, so for example, they set up the European Coal and Steel Community, where six Christian democratic countries they merged their coal and steel industries under a single high authority, and that small step was the first step towards what we today have as the European Union. So it's often forgotten that the European Union was a Christian democratic project. It was a Catholic project, and it comes very clearly from that principle of subsidiarity.
Yeah, and seemingly from that experience in World War II, where the nation state was so powerful and sort of all consuming. But as you
Yes.
said, that led not just in Germany to a dispersion of power within the state to more local governments, states, and whatnot, but also to higher levels with
Yeah.
the eventual formation of the EU and, of course, the United Nations at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much for joining me, Tony. I really appreciate it.
Most welcome, Robert. Good. Thank you very much and good luck.
Thank you.